Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Yascha Mounk. I teach political science at Harvard University, and I'm the author of People Vs Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yes, we do. We have Yascha Mounk on the show. You can find him at Yascha_Mounk on Twitter, and you definitely should follow. You are going to love this conversation. And of course, whenever we have a good political science conversation, we bring in our heavy hitter, Dr. Richard Ledet, my field partner from Afghanistan. And we're going to take a little bit of the, sorry, Dr. Yascha Mounk, let's take a little bit of the ivory tower and put it on the ground, and we're going to rub some dirt on the ivory, and the ivory is going to make sure that we know what we're doing, and we're going to, I think, give everybody a conversation that you haven't had before. Look, Yascha's been on a lot of different shows. He actually has his own podcast, and you guys should definitely check that out. It's called The Good Fight, and he gets fantastic guests on there. Ann Applebaum, Catherine Rappel, Evan McMullen, all kinds of great people, and Yascha is an absolute expert. I mean, he teaches at Harvard, for crying out loud. So we're really fortunate to have him. I've got Scott Shipman sitting off to my left, kind of right seating with me here. But I want to get going. But before we go too far, there's a couple of terms that I wanted to give the audience a PhD level definition, so that when we talk about them, we're not going to get tripped up. The first one is we're talking about liberal democracy. What is liberal democracy?
The first way of defining liberal democracy is by telling you what it isn't, right? Because liberal in the United States often means liberal conservative, Democrat Republican, that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about, right? In the sense in which I'm going to be talking about liberal today, you know, George W. Bush was as much of a liberal as Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan was as much of a liberal as Bill Clinton. So look, what does our political system actually, it tries to do two basic things. It tries to give people a real sense of individual freedom, where we can say what we want to say or not say, where we can worship whichever God we want, whichever way we think is right, or not worship at all, where we can spend our lives how we want. And in order to preserve that, we found over centuries, we need a couple of things. First of all, we need individual rights. That's why we have something like the Bill of Rights in the United States. And secondly, we need the rule of law. We need to make sure that, you know, the police is independent, that your local mayor or governor or president doesn't get to tell the police chief, you know what, I don't like that guy there, why don't you go and make up some grounds to throw him in prison? So that's what we mean by the liberal element. This complex of things we need to sustain our individuals. But of course, our political system also promises something else, which is collective self-rule. That there isn't a dictator or a monarch or a priest or an imam or anybody else who gets to tell us how to lead our lives. We collectively, as citizens of the United States, same is true in other countries and other liberal democracies, make our decisions for ourselves. A liberal democracy is a political system that manages to combine these two things, in which individuals have a freedom protected and guaranteed, and we together get to determine our politics.
Yeah, that's a great definition. So what you're saying is that it's all about me not having plastic straws and pro-abortion.
That's not what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. All right, so let's do a couple other definitions.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that word, Pete. Got to be careful with that word liberal, you know.
That damn liberals. Hey, I also
want to turn people off immediately when you say it. You know, but that's why it's important to get these definitions out of the way.
That's why we start right there. Let's also define populism and nationalism, so we know what we're talking about with those two, Dr. Mounk.
Sure. So, I mean, populism, you made a telling little slip up there before you caught yourself, which is you were nearly going to say popularism, right?
Yes.
And the problem is that it sounds like, you know, people want to be popular. And what's wrong with that, right? We live in a democracy. I was talking about that means self-determination, right? Well, sure, if most people like somebody, then they should get to do what they want, right? That's the idea. Well, look, that's not what we mean by populism. What political scientists mean when we talk about populism is a set of politicians who basically say, I alone stand for the people. And anybody who disagrees with me, anybody who's not on my side, is not a real part of the people. They are illegitimate. We don't really need to take what they want seriously. And so that's something very different. Right? It's normal that any political candidate is going to sometimes use some sharp political language, where they're going to say, you know what, the people who are governing right now, they don't really know what they're doing. You should trust me and vote for me instead. All of that is perfectly ordinary. But when they start to say, you know what, the other person is so bad, we should send them to prison. You know what, anybody who disagrees with me is unpatriotic, they're un-American. That becomes much more. What populists tend to do once they're in office is then to precisely undermine the kind of independent institutions that I was talking about, to sacrifice the rights of particular people who the majority might not like, and thereby impugn our individual liberties. And that's why it's dangerous. Now, nationalism, it's a little hard to define. It's the solidarity that people who believe themselves to be members of the same nation have towards each other. And it's difficult to define, I think, because there are such different versions of it. And we might talk about this a little bit more later in the conversation. So there's a version of nationalism, which is ethnic nationalism, which basically says that where I grew up in Germany or Sweden, in Italy, in lots of parts of Europe, a lot of people believe that. But what makes a real Swede is that they descend from people who've been living in that country for centuries. They come from a particular kind of ethnic group. Perhaps they have a particular kind of religion, even if they might not be very devout. They're Protestant. And so anybody who lives in that country who comes from the outside can't be a real Swede, and they shouldn't get the same rights, they shouldn't get the same treatment. That's one definition of nationalism. And a lot of the left tends to reject nationalism because they don't like them. And one of the arguments that I make in my book is that there's other definitions of nationalism as well. Like one that all of sort of the historical shortcomings of the United States has actually in some ways dominated American history, and that's civic nationalism. The idea that what makes you an American is not your skin color, it's not your religion, it's not even whether you're born here. It's whether you are willing to subscribe to a set of basic political ideals and to undertake to have solidarity with your fellow citizens and to become a United States citizen. And if you are, then you're a member of a nation. And then we have special duty to protect each other, to help each other, to serve each other's interests. That doesn't mean we have to go and pick conflicts with other countries. It doesn't mean that we think the only way to do right by the people of the United States is to do wrong by other people. But it means that we are proud of our common membership in this nation and that we have certain forms of solidarity and duty towards each other, up to defending our country, which we're happy to undertake.
So it sounds to me like civic nationalism versus the ethnic nationalism. You can actually have a different type of nationalism that's you're still patriotic. You still have these sentiments towards your country, if you will, towards your nation. But with civic nationalism, it doesn't have to be grounded in some sort of racial or ethnic identity, even religious identity. So there's a subset here, or different type of nationalism. And that civic nationalism, I mean, that could be people that are united behind the idea of Bill of Rights, rule of law, liberal democracy. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's exactly right. But if you have an understanding of civic nationalism, then, it is in a way one of the oldest phrases in the United States, a pluribus unum, that we can be very different from each other and yet come together as one, which doesn't mean that we're all going to be the same, right? We know that the United States is a pretty crazy, complicated country with lots of people who are very dissimilar to each other, and that's fine, though we can still think of ourselves and of each other as Americans. And that's the idea of civic nationalism. And it stands in competition, as you say, to this ethnic nationalism that basically says, no, there has to be a certain kind of homogeneity in our country. But we're not going to be exactly the same unless you are, for example, white and Christian, you're not a real American. Or unless you originate on the Indian subcontinent and you're a Hindu, you're not a real Indian. Civic nationalists like me want to reject that idea.
So how do we strike a balance between healthy nationalism, civic nationalism, and we always want diversity, but the opposite of diversity is unity. So how do you blend those things? Because when you look at a nation like Japan, that's primarily what we would all identify as Japanese people, it's easier for them to move in a common direction because they are a common people. They are all one set for the most part, and a lot of countries have that they don't have. I mean, I would say like that New Guinea where they have a complete pan diversity, but how do you balance the legitimate desire to protect each other and then also balance out how you bring in new ideas, new thought, all of the people that come to America that make it great, whether they come here with literally nothing in a shipping container and then 2 generations later there's millions of. How do you do that?
Yeah, look, it's a really hard thing to do, and political scientists know that this is a hard thing to do. But there's different models of how to make that work. The United States has never been homogeneous in that kind of way.
Right.
We've always been a country of immigration, of people coming from different parts of Europe with very different religious denominations. Today, in our imagination, it may not make such a huge difference what particular form of Protestantism you subscribe to. But for hundreds of years in the early history of the United States, those differences seemed and were monumental to people, right? So we've always had a model where we try to make it work by reconciling those differences. There's other countries that have historically relied on much more homogeneity. And I'm actually sort of more pessimistic about how easy it will be for them to make it work, because they don't have this imagination that what it is to be an American is to be a citizen, to pay allegiance to the flag. They think, no, it's this ethnic stuff, it's this religious stuff, right? So I'm actually pretty optimistic about the United States being able to do that, because we have always done. But we have to get away from this idea of how much nationalism, which I think is strong on parts of the left, that basically say, look, we've seen how dangerous nationalism can be. And if you read a little bit of 20th century history, they're absolutely right about that. World War II was caused by extreme German nationalism and led to hundreds of millions of victims around the world. And so their temptation, their instinct is to say, let's run away from nationalism. This can only be dangerous. The way to manage it is to try and dampen it down. And my metaphor is a different one. I think of nationalism as a sort of half-domesticated animal. But if you leave it on its own, or you allow the worst kinds of people to come in and stoke it, it's going to run wild,
right,
and do a lot of damage. And what you have to do instead is to try and tame it, to own what it does, to engage with it, right, to make it more docile. So it's not for me about do we want more nationalism or do we want less nationalism. It's about what do we take that nationalism to mean? How do we fight to make sure that when people chant USA, USA, they don't mean, throw anybody who's Latino out of the country. They mean let's stand and stand in solidarity with each other and build a good country. And I think that's what most Americans do mean.
I like that analogy because it makes me think that there actually has to be some learning. That wild animal is just going to go off of instinct. But if there's some learning involved, how as a population are we supposed to learn?
It's hard. It's hard. But I think one way that we learn is by having shared institutions, not just shared political institutions, but shared social institutions. But when people actually have, when they go to school and there's classmates who are of different ethnicities and religions, when we go to the workplace and have co-workers who are from different places, when we go to the army, and they have comrades who are from all kinds of different parts of the country, with all kinds of different backgrounds. That's when we forge real commonality. And I think that is something where we politically have to do much more, because unfortunately there still are forms of disadvantage and segregation and so on, which make it harder for most Americans to have those experiences. But it's also where parts of the left have to be a little bit careful, because I think that there is a certain instinct to celebrate difference and to some extent to even demand sort of each person to stay in their own lane, in one phrase that's now quite popular, which actually runs counter to the ideal of a multi-ethnic society that I have. It actually tells people, you know what, stay in your own groups, and we like diversity, but we like each group to stay amongst themselves. I think that to me is is a completely wrong idea of how we're going to make a multi-ethnic society work.
I like that because that brings up some of the stuff that I've studied in my own work, which is, I mean, it takes a healthy amount of civic engagement if we're indeed going to learn.
Yeah.
And your being in the military reference, I think, was spot on for me personally, because I'm from the South, so there's a lot of white, a lot of black, but it wasn't until I was in the military that I really got to engage with Hispanics, for example, and that was at a very young age, where I even, one of my best buddies in the Army was from Puerto Rico. I had another friend from Cuba. Never met anyone from Cuba before, but we all, you're right, we were able to have some learning experiences together, and we did have shared values, even though we're all of a different ethnic groups.
I wanted to ask, so when we look at these different groups that we're trying to blend together in a moving thing, we have so many different areas of contention, right? Like, so I saw a meme the other day. It was Jean-Luc Picard going, "Why do they keep saying we're a democracy when we're a representative republic?" And then there's people that say we're a fascist government, and all these different things. If we can't even decide what kind of government we have in our normal day-to-day rhetoric, we talk with each other, how the heck do we get on the same sheet on a liberal democracy, or even start to understand that?
Yeah. I mean, that's hard, but I actually think there's more unity of understanding there than some of those fights would suggest, right? I mean, okay. You reference this. I guess over time I talk about liberal democracy, and a lot of talks for somebody who makes exactly that point. Right? It's like, oh, actually, we're don't you know we're a representative republic? Look, I know that. Thank you very much. I talk about it in my book, actually. One of my favorite texts is one of the Federalist Papers, which says that the real distinction between a democracy and a republic is that in a republic, the kind of thing that we, the founding fathers, actually want to put in place, there is a total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the government. When you teach that to a bunch of 18-year-old kids, they say, wait, that's my political system? What are you talking about? So it's an important thing to make people understand the complicated origins of our political society. But at the same time, every American, including ones who talk about the constitutional republic, does believe that we collectively should be allowed to rule ourselves. But part of the point of our political system is to sustain a set of institutions that actually do over time allow us to have that autonomy. That we don't want to allow a dictator, but we don't want to allow a monarch or a priest to tell us what to do. And the way we do that is indeed through a set of relatively complicated institutions that come from the Republican government, democratic political tradition. But it's pretty clear to us what that means, which is that we still want to be able, ultimately, that we as Americans collectively decide what's going to happen to us. And I think we agreed on that, including those people who say, oh, we don't actually live in a democracy.
I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to use this in class. This is going to take care of one of my lectures for me, so thanks, Yascha.
Sure, my pleasure.
Back with this theme of all the different variables in our crazy, exponentially weird, multivariate equation that is the U.S. We also have this, and you talk about this gap, this split. I wouldn't call it quite a schism because that would kind of be religious, but there are a variety of chasms that we have to try to get across. And Dr. Rich talked about educating, and it's easy to think that you are educated, but we also have a tendency to get into the echo chamber. We just had Peter Van Buren on the show. It's actually his show posted today because he was just banned on Twitter, where you have a guy who makes a zombie joke about MAGA followers eating a reporter's face. Whatever. It can be a little off-colored, but that's not something that can't be part of the marketplace of ideas. But Sarah Zhang, who writes clearly racist things, is still on Twitter. So and it's not a commentary on that decision by Twitter, but we have this divide between what is okay and what isn't okay. And if we're going to have a liberal democracy, that requires a little bit of tolerance on each other. Like, my freedom doesn't mean that you don't have freedom. Like, I have to be able to withstand, what you think you need to do, and vice versa. What are your thoughts on this chasm, and how do we deal with it? And is it any bigger than it's ever been? I mean, we often lose sight of 20, 30 years ago, and heck, 500 years ago. So help me understand that, actually, the both of you, please.
I certainly think that there's been more illiberal and more anti-democratic moments in U.S. history, but what we've seen is, I think, a very serious regression in which practically no agreement across the political aisle on a whole bunch of basic principles and institutions. And that's really worrying, right? I mean, look, even, I have my interpretation of the fight between, for example, Donald Trump and the FBI and the Department of Justice. In my mind, it is a case of a president attacking those institutions in ways that are unfair and unjust. Other people may disagree with me on that, but even if you disagree on that, what we have in common is a recognition that we have no consensus about something that we really should have social consensus about, right? So that's the first thing. I mean, on the other questions you're talking about, obviously there is a distinction between private entities and organizations which can regulate how people, what kind of speech should be allowed on them. And so in that sense, I'm less worried about Twitter banning various people or whatever than I would be if this was the government itself, or if it was, as is the case in some European country, the government telling people that certain kind of speech is actually going to be punishable by prison and so on. But because Twitter and Facebook now are very important public fora, we do also need both a social conversation and hopefully some amount of legislation around how you ensure that people with different kinds of political views retain access to that. In the same way in which there's historically been legislation and Supreme Court jurisprudence in the United States that more can't just ban all kinds of political protests. And certainly they can't selectively ban political protests on its territory, precisely because a mall plays such an important civic function in a community. And that makes sense to me. So then we have to get into specifics. I mean, I think that generally speaking, fewer people should be banned and fewer people should be fired for what they say. And we should have, we should engage a little less in outrage machines on all sides of the political spectrum. I myself have written about Sarah Jong. There's a column about her on Slate. One of the things that I found sad in the debate is that there was such a predictable pattern in what people said about it. That people on the right attacked her, often called for her to be fired, or even characterized her speech as being obviously on a par with, say, the alt-right. And when people on the left basically uncritically came to her defense and not just said that she shouldn't be fired, which is something I agree with, because I was saying I think that a lot fewer people should be fired for various things they said, but they also celebrated the tweets and said that actually, there's really nothing to be worried about at all in the kinds of things that she said. And so I wrote an article that from, a moderate left-wing perspective, tried to explain why the kind of speech she engaged in is very noxious and precisely doesn't help us to build the kind of multi-ethnic society that I talk about, that it divides people across ethnic and religious lines, that it tries to emphasize what divides us rather than what we have in common. That this is the reason why, even from a left-wing perspective, we should be very careful and be willing to criticize that kind of rhetoric.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, too, to go back to something you mentioned earlier, Twitter, Facebook, these are private companies. They can ban people. Just like no shirt, no shoes, no service.
Right.
They can ban people from their forum. So it's really up to the users and the consumers to use and consume with some. Well, I go back to that civic virtue, because when we're just trying to incite people, we know that we're not building on shared experiences here. We know we're not building on common ground. I mean, Pete, you bring up the idea of the memes. I think they're funny, but they're not helping. If we just go immediately to the extremes all the time, what we're doing is also taking a very, very complex system and trying to understand complex processes and trying to understand it with a snapshot and a few words. And that's just not helpful. Because I've seen some of the same memes and I've seen some of the same cartoon strips, and they make me laugh. But for people who are not completely understanding what concepts like liberal democracy mean, populism and nationalism, the potential for taking those things and running with them the wrong way, and by the wrong way, I mean in a way that's not going to help us sustain the system that we currently, gives us all these freedoms and liberties that we enjoy. Well, that's a slippery slope where I think that the responsible citizen stays away from.
We seem to have a lot of slippery slopes, though. At what point are we crying wolf? I mean, is this just a normal exchange? I mean, I know we're worried about liberal democracy and maintaining it, but there seems to be so many areas where, we can't give ground here. And like the NRA, they can't give an inch because of what they do. And this is not commentary about the NRA qualities or anything, but it does speak to the Himalayan slippery slope problem that we have, where there's all these slippery slopes in different directions.
Well, I'll jump in because before I lose this thought here, it's kind of like what Yascha said earlier, and what he I think was alluding to. When you have a member of the executive branch, actually the head of the executive branch, an elected president, attacking the Justice Department consistently, that I think is something that is, well, for me, it's very hard to tolerate. I may or may not like some of Trump's policies, but when you are attacking one of the institutions that is part of the bedrock of our rule of law, then I think it's time that, other than political scientists, I think other citizens should be, waving their flags and saying something's not right about this.
I think that's exactly right, but we need to have things that aren't politicized. Right? We need to have things that stand apart from and above politics. And I personally agree that certain forms of constraints on how we talk about the world should be included in those. So obviously we shouldn't be allowed to punish people for breaking those kinds of norms or anything like that. But I think we as citizens who actually have hoping to share this country with each other for centuries to come should be very careful about the kind of inflammatory language we might engage in, whether it's against certainly other ethnic religious groups or just against people who prefer a different political party, who have different values, who have different kinds of religious and moral beliefs and so on. I think that's one really crucial thing. But the other thing that's even more crucial when you look at which societies have historically succeeded, which societies have historically failed, is to recognize that we're always going to have strong disagreements with each other, and we need a set of common rules and procedures and norms in order to regulate how it is that we're going to. And so, precisely because we're going to have deep disagreements with each other for always and for decades to come, we need to together respect a set of institutions and rules and norms and so on that can actually structure the nature of our disagreement. So that we can say, look, I really want this kind of policy, you really want that kind of policy, we feel very strongly about that, but we know how we settle that difference. It's through an electoral process. It's through institutions like the FBI and so on that aren't politicized, which make decisions based on the law rather than based on the opinion of a president. And when that starts to be attacked, it's very, very dangerous, because then it means that elections become existential. But we're no longer just about getting my policy that I prefer through for the next 4 years, and if I lose, then I'm going to be sad, and I'm going to get drunk, and I'm going to say some mean things about the president, but I'll suck it up, and 4 years from now I have a chance to get rid of them. I start to feel, you know what, these people win, and they're not going to respect those shared rules and norms and so on. I don't know whether I and people like me are going to end up in prison, or whether 4 years from now we're still going to have a chance to make our plea to our fellow Americans for why we should change who the president. And that's very, very different.
Yeah, it's hard to make. Boy, yeah. Yeah. Woo. All right. So
see, that's why we can go back to the plug Yascha gave earlier for everybody needs to go to college, man.
Everybody needs to go to college.
You learn this stuff in college if you pay attention.
All right. Well, then let me ask the question that a lot of audience members are asking. We just had the firing of Peter Storrs. I think that's how you say his name, and he's not unbiased. And look, I'm a counterintelligence agent by trade from the military. When you have top secret on your home server, that means you've got my name running an operation, all the facts, where anybody can exploit it. That would be a crime if I did it. But when Hillary Clinton did it, and this is not commentary about politics, this is about FBI, right? If they can't figure out how to convict that, then a lot of people get to say, this guy is writing anti-Trump Trump tweets and he's on an investigation about him, and he did this other investigation where they couldn't find fault with Hillary Clinton, I'm suspect of the FBI. We get to have that conversation. We also get to say, boy, it sure does seem like these high-end institutions of education seem to skew to the left in a lot of areas. Now, maybe not in the STEM fields, but certainly in the soft sciences. I mean, that's legitimate critique. How do we, if we're going to have people be educated, how do we ensure that there is a open forum when there is so much distrust? And look, the FBI, we don't trust them. We also don't trust our representatives, and there's a lot of people we don't trust. But what do we do about that, fellas?
So let's talk about Peter Strzok, right? Because I think it's an important case that both shows the gray on gray here, but also where the red lines are, right? So a few things. I mean, employees of the federal government are allowed to have personal political opinions and communicate them privately. He held negative opinions both of Hillary Clinton and of Donald Trump. But it's also clear that the process that the FBI went through with the report by the Inspector General and so on showed that he had done certain things which were clearly a breach of his duties, right? Including, as you mentioned, emailing a draft of an affidavit containing sensitive information to his private email address, and including some text messages which may give the impression that he was planning to essentially sabotage him. The Inspector General report also concluded that he never in any way let his political bias influence his actions, and that he didn't have enough sway over the overall investigation for that to be in any way changed by it. And yet they criticized him heavily. And what Christopher Wray, the now director of the FBI after James Comey was fired, told a congressional hearing is that the investigation into how to punish Peter Strzok would be done by the book, which to any reasonable observer means using the normal kind of procedures through which the FBI goes when one of its many, many employees does something wrong, which happens all of the time, right? And so they did that. And what it's called the Bureau for Professional Violations or something like that, I forget the exact name, decided is that he should be demoted and he should be suspended for 2 weeks. And that is in keeping with the kinds of decisions they have usually made. That is the kind of punishment that, so far as I can glean from the facts, is usually made of people in comparable cases, right? So here's the thing. That was overruled by the deputy director of the FBI, who decided to fire him instead. In a political environment in which the president of the United States keeps taking to Twitter to demand his firing, in which he has already fired the head of the FBI. He's already fired a deputy director of the FBI. He's already...
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
The head of the FBI. He's already fired a deputy director of the FBI. He's already gotten rid of various investigating agents and so on. So, if the worst thing that Strzok has done, and I think that's by far the worst thing he has done, is to make it possible for people to doubt the political independence of the FBI. There's no evidence that he actually acted in a biased way, but he gave reasonable reason to think, you know what, perhaps these guys aren't really impartial, that's a problem. Then firing somebody, overruling what this usual body at the FBI decided, giving in to very overt, very extreme political pressure from the President of the United States to get a specific civil servant fired, is a much bigger reason for people to say, how can I trust today that the FBI is politically independent? How can I trust that if there's a rank and file FBI agent who's, investigating some kind of white-collar crime in New York City, and he happens to come across, let's say, something that incriminates Jared Kushner, but he doesn't say, you know what, I'm going to turn a blind eye to that, because who knows what happens to my career if I take this up the way I usually do. I don't have trust in that. And that's a very serious problem. And so in that way, I think the firing of Peter Strzok is a grave violation of the independence of law enforcement agencies and so on, that we need to preserve, which doesn't mean that Peter Strzok didn't do anything wrong, which doesn't even mean that if the independent body that was investigating him had recommended firing him, then perhaps it would have been appropriate to fire him. But that's not what happened.
And that essentially erodes trust in our institutions. And that's why this is so problematic. And that's why citizens who are concerned, even if you're on the right or the left, I think that being concerned about this particular FBI agent's firing, I think this is a big deal. Another part of this conversation, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't he removed from the investigation? This collusion or the Rush investigation, whatever form of it, whatever it's morphed into, wasn't he removed as soon as his actions came to light? I mean, shouldn't that at least, and this gets omitted from the conversation, I think, shouldn't this actually speak positively of the FBI and the people in charge, that as soon as his actions came to light, he was taken off the case?
Yeah, he was working HR, which is,
Yeah.
in any organization like the FBI, sort of the worst punishment you can get, right? He was sort of saying, this guy works this shift, this guy works that shift. But
All right, so let's get away from a little bit of that, and let's talk a little bit about. So in the latter half of the book, you start to talk about your recommendations and everything, and you obviously have the license to do that. Rich has taught me a lot about how these things work. But my question that I kept being struck with was, in a true liberal democracy, does it force iteration faster than especially in the United States? We could talk about Poland and Greece and other places that are a little bit homogeneous in terms of ethnicity, but does liberal democracy move faster than 330 million people can handle if it's if it requires that much tolerance, that much education?
well, I don't know how much education it requires. It certainly requires some amount of tolerance, but that's not a question of liberal democracy, right? I mean, we live in a country that is very diverse. So if we want to keep the peace in this country, we're going to have to get people to tolerate each other. I think that's going to be easier done in a liberal democracy than in other political systems. But it's not like, because I like liberal democracy, I sort of somehow think people have to tolerate each other. We got to tolerate each other. I mean, it's either that or violence in the streets. And that's something that I think a lot of sort of critics of what I call multi-ethnic society don't really understand. I mean, sure, perhaps in Japan today, policymakers have the choice to restrict immigration, which, by the way, means that the Japanese population is shrinking rapidly. So it has some disadvantages. They can say, you know what, we make that choice because it'll be easier to keep our society together. And the way it's historically worked, we have doubts about how much diversity we can make work here. That is a historical choice that is to some extent open to the Japanese people, not completely, because they're relatively diverse actually in certain ways, but that's possible. In the United States, that's not possible. In much of Europe, it's no longer possible because we have people of different religions, of different races, of different origins living together. And so either you somehow essentially ethnically and religiously cleanse the country, which would, vast suffering of hundreds of millions of people and essentially civil war, or you got to make it work. So I'm not willing to think, can we make it work? How does it? I'm only interested in thinking, how do we make it work? Because that's the only realistic alternative we have.
A lot of your research that you cite talks about the desire or the acceptance of younger generations to consider more of a totalitarian style of government and this is like one of the big fears is, by the way, we're talking to Dr. Yascha Mounk, who teaches at Harvard. You guys should definitely check out his book. I've read it. It's fantastic. It's called The People Vs Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. We've talked a lot about the Trump things, but let's also talk about the extremely large electorate that's coming up, these young folks, and where their mindsets are. What do we need to do? What do we need to worry about? What the heck is going on?
Well, I think, there's polarization and there's the way in which people get incited against each other on social media and, something that's actually not representative of of most Americans starts to look representative, right? So I don't think that most people engage in the kind of racially incendiary language we were talking about earlier, but that's what a lot of the right now thinks the left does, right? Because that's the most visible manifestations of it. So that's all of those reasons that make us think that we don't have much in common. There's deeper reasons to be frustrated, right? So in the United States, from 1945 to 1960, the living standard of an average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. And since 1985, it's essentially been flat, it's been stagnant. So that makes a huge difference in how people think about politics. And so I think, one thing that politicians have to do is to put some of those things right, to actually make sure that ordinary people feel a real improvement of it, that we emphasize this sense of inclusive nationalism, where we're proud of our country, but in a way that remains open to everybody who actually lives here, and that we educate people about our political system. I don't know what that's like at your university, Rich, but I don't think people at Harvard spend a lot of time actually transmitting our political values to students. That's not how political scientists think of their job, and that's a real problem, I think, because from Plato to Aristotle and from Rousseau to the founding fathers, every set of thinkers who actually thought about how do we make a democracy work or how do we make a governing republic work, realized that spreading its basic values, its basic consensus, is one of the absolutely crucial things, and we stop doing that. So I think if we fight for all of those things, we can make a real difference.
Yeah, and that I think when you're talking about values here, we're not necessarily talking about Republican Party or Democratic Party. We're talking about the values that I try to teach my students are tolerance, engagement in your political system, and we're also talking about you have to be knowledgeable, and that's what we all need to have, and those are the type of values, and that's not politically liberal or politically conservative. Those are the type of values that I think coincide with developing an understanding of what civic nationalism is supposed to be. I'm teaching here in the Deep South. My views are my own views. They're not the views of Troy University. But here in the Deep South, I know that there's a fear by some people that we are in the classroom turning all of our students into members of the Democratic Party. And that is not what political scientists are doing. That is not what we do. So when we use that word, when you use that term values, I know you and I know what we're talking about, but the listener out there might think, oh man, they're trying to turn them into a bunch of pro-abortion, anti-gun people. That's not what we're doing. That's not the type of values that we're trying to transmit.
Yeah, the kinds of values that we should try to transmit are the ones we need to sustain a common country, which is that we can have deep political disagreements about all kinds of things, and hopefully good education allows you to make your own position more smartly, to understand where your adversary is coming from, because we all have psychological biases which make it easy for us to think that we're smart and everybody else is stupid, and hopefully good education forces you to understand the reasons why other people disagree with you a little bit better. But the thing we should all agree on is, the basics of our political system: freedom of speech, respect for our electoral institutions, respect for the Bill of Rights, respect for trying to make this political experiment work.
Yeah, and I like conversations about the freedom of speech, because we do have to remember that with all these freedoms we have, there's some responsibility that comes with it. I mean, the best example is you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. There's plenty of examples, but specifically with the First Amendment, I mean, we have to use this responsibly. And it takes me back to the idea of politics through memes. You can do a lot of damage with that freedom of speech when you're just trying to incite people to violence. And that is not the type of values that, I think we should be tolerating. But, how do I tolerate someone who wants to destroy me and wants to destroy the political system? Yeah, how do you tolerate intolerance,
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we have to defend. There's a simple mistake that people make about freedom of speech, which is that they think, people like freedom of speech because they think that anything that anybody has to say has to be a value. And that's not the case. For lots of things, but not a value. that our society would be better if that kind of speech didn't exist. Shut it up. The reason to defend freedom of speech is that we've learned through painful experience in history that no one individual and no one institution can be trusted with being the arbiter of what you can and what you can't say. Right? Yeah. I wouldn't want my best friend to decide who gets to say what in society. But that doesn't mean, as you say, that there's no moral obligation that comes with that. Part of freedom of speech in this country is that I can go and stand on the next street corner and tell every person who walks past me that they're ugly. I don't think a court should be allowed to punish me for doing that. That doesn't make that a responsible or nice or sensible thing to do with my time.
But we are doing that a lot, though, right? We're all sort of beating each other up, and heck, I was in a conversation the other day on Facebook, and that's my fault for being there and trying to have a conversation.
Don't do it.
But my gender, my ethnicity, my perceived socioeconomic status and upbringing, my perceived religion, my military status, all of these things were used in a derogatory way as I tried to say we should help homeless veterans instead of complaining about the president putting on a parade. It was like, gosh, there's just so much hate out there and confusion. How on earth do we ever close this gap, fellas? What do we need to do do we have to have some tremendous calamity hit us to make us all say, let's all fight these other fights later? Or is this a good result of a country that's, I'm going to say the words, relatively stable and full of opportunity?
I mean, here's the thing that's really hard, which is that I think we have to start by standing up to people on our own side. Mm-hmm. Right? Because, if you so I'm guessing here, Pete, that you're more on the right.
I'm in the middle. I piss everybody off. I really do.
That's the best.
I ask questions from a right kind of stance because I know that part of the audience is listening as well, and I want to make sure that we account for those guys. But look, I'm not even pro-life. I'm pro or pro-choice. I'm pro-abortion. Like, we have to have it. There's no good solution to this, and so I don't want my daughter having to go to Mexico to get an abortion if she makes a bad decision. I'm left leaning on plenty of things. So. I'm sorry, I jumped in on your question. But, yeah.
I just meant, it's nice for me to police, the outright or something like that, and then for the right to say, oh, look, this or that lefty said something crazy. That's not going to improve it, right? Because it'll just feed the polarization spout. And we spend some of our time doing that, and that's fine. But, it's people who are more conservative who've got to say, hey, you know what, this thing that, some Republican politicians said is really unacceptable, or this thing that people from extreme on the outright say really is beyond the pale, this is not. They might call themselves right-wing, I'm conservative, I might be conservative, like, this is nothing to do. And in the same way, people on the left have to be self-critical and tell people when, just abusing people because of the race or their religion or a military status or something like that is just unhelpful, and it vilifies people in unfair ways, and it's just not conducive to any kind of constructive dialogue. And there's people on the right who can come in and say that and make all those points, but it's the people on the left who need to use the capital they have there in order to gain a hearing. So that's what I try to do, for example, in some of these contexts where, most people on the left say, oh, well, I'm not really going to criticize that. And I say, hey, is it really a helpful way of speaking about the world to tweet something like, look at how much pleasure I get out of being it's kind of sick how much pleasure I get out of being cruel to old white men. But maybe meant as a joke in certain ways, right, given that it sort of bills itself as being, part of a rebellion against an unfair system. It may not be as bad as if you said sort of the inverse, but that is not a helpful way of talking about the world. It's not a way of moving towards the kind of multi-ethnic society that we want to build. And so that's why I called it out. And it was a little scary to call it out because I knew that I would piss a lot of my friends off and that a lot of people wouldn't like that. So that's what we got to do. And there's plenty of people who do that on the right. I'm thinking of somebody like David French, one of the writers at National Review, who I think is really good at clear, proud conservative. He's pro-gun, pro-life, etc., etc. So when people talk in uncivil or unpleasant ways on the right, he's willing to call it out. And it doesn't always make him popular, but it gives me a lot of respect for him.
So Yascha, what should I tell my students when they ask me, what do we do when the alt-right shows up to demonstrate at our campus? Or what do we do when David Duke wants to show up? What's the best response for them down here in Alabama? And not all of my students are lefties, by the way, but they're all not extreme right, you know.
Right,
We got
right.
some diversity of thought here, but what's the best response for them?
I think protest robustly, bring lots and lots of people out for peaceful protest. I would rather have 10,000 students show up for peaceful protest than 300 for violent one. Show them that 25 people show up to go and see David Duke's speech, and there's 10,000 people in front of the venue exercising the right to peaceful protest. That's the best way of dealing with that. Now, by the way, I think that it depends on once you get to people who really essentially deny the right of certain students to exist. I get the attempts by the administration to ensure that they don't speak out. Somebody like David Duke, I think that's a very extreme case. For a lot of the other speakers who have been controversial, I think this is part of the responsibility we were talking about earlier, that any student organization has the right to invite them. I would wish that they be more responsible and that they don't invite people to campus who don't have much of an intellectual contribution to make, and who they just invite in order to get publicity and in order to stoke tension. Once they do, if they're not as extreme as something like David Duke, then I think the administration of a university has a duty to ensure that they can actually speak and express their opinions, because otherwise you get what's called the heckler's veto. Otherwise, the person who's willing to shut most things down gets to determine the limits of what is acceptable. And I certainly don't think that it's legitimate to shut people up violently, but it's absolutely legitimate to try and get as many students as possible out to stand in front of a venue and hold signs and chant and show that they disassociate themselves with those views and that particular speaker.
I wanted to ask you, we're about to come up on a presidential election, and it seems like it might be a bit of a free-for-all since, Donald Trump kind of broke that system. And we're so terrible towards our president. I don't know how long, I guess it's been the last 3 presidents, most of us have not liked that person. So who do we need? I mean, left, right, whatever, who cares about that? But who's someone that's going to draw us more towards the middle so we can actually make progress on some of this lack of unity that we have? Who do you like, or what type of person do you like? Because we can't have 2 near felons running for office. We need to have a higher quality person, but we also have to not be a dick to anybody that comes in and says, I'd like to be president.
Look, I mean, I think that we've had a set of choices in the last 12 to 16 years, which weren't perfect, but which we could live with. I mean, I thought that, if you go back to 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were both very honorable men. I think in 2008, John McCain and Barack Obama were both decent people, and McCain, by the way, recognized that in a way that I thought was precisely encapsulated the spirit of a democracy. When in the days before the election, at a town hall event, a lady stood up and said, look, I think Barack Obama is a Muslim and an Arab and he's dangerous for our country, or something like that.
Yeah, all right.
And McCain said, look, I have deep differences with Mr. Obama. I think I'd make a much better president than him. But he's an honorable man, and you don't have to be scared if he runs our country. That's exactly that spirit. And the same, in 2004 and 2000, going back to 96, the minimum we need to demand is somebody who actually has minimum respect for the political opponent, minimum respect for the political system, for the rules and norms of our democracy, so that for the people who are going to lose, and close to 50% of the population are always going to lose. That's the nature of a democracy. For the people who are going to lose, they can say, hey, you know what? I don't have to have existential fear for the next 4 years. I feel like I'm still going to be treated decently in my own country, and I don't have to be worried that 4 years from now, I no longer have the chance to vote this person who I dislike out of office.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to look at the presidency, and hopefully we get some people that maybe are in that vein. And like you said, we haven't necessarily had the choice that we want, but heck, we never get that. Rich, I was asking Dr. Mounk about, we had, I'll call them two near felons in our last election that were their viable options. And we're terrible towards the president. You and I have had this conversation before. Like, we just treat the person like crap because most of us don't like that person. Is there a person out there or a type of person that you think we need to have as we try to protect our very delicate political stability that we have? Because you and I have been to very unstable places where instability is the norm. Mm-hmm. What do we need to do in the future? I don't necessarily need to know about a specific person, but what do you think?
See, I don't know if there's necessarily a person that's going to do it, other than bringing together a lot of the things that we've talked about. Like, you got to have a high amount of respect for your own institutions, regardless of who's running those institutions. That's why we have elections, you know. So I would say, though, it's not necessarily, like, as a society, it's not necessarily a person in that office, but I would suggest something a little off the wall here, that maybe American citizens start focusing their attention on local politics and state politics, because it's not the president that makes sure that the potholes get fixed.
Right.
You know, it's not the president that's making sure that the local school board is choosing good quality textbooks, you know. So I think that's also one way for citizens to see some of the good and that government can actually do, would be to, you know, take politics and turn it back locally. Now, that being said, we all need to pay attention to what's happening at the top, you know. But what we can do is then move from the local to the state level, and pay attention a little bit more there to what's happening in our state houses. But what we also need to do, and this is why I said it's not just one person, I think we need to give more power back to the legislative branch. The legislative branch needs to take a little bit more of its power back, because, you know, you might not like Trump. Well, guess what? What did you do to change your representation? You know,
Yeah.
That, I think, is one thing that could, having a legislative branch that's willing to hold a president accountable, and it doesn't matter if it's a Democratic Party member or a Republican Party member who's at the top. You know, there's a reason our founding fathers put the legislative branch first in Article 1, because that was supposed to be the most important branch, in my opinion. You know, so I don't know if Yascha agrees with that. You know, I don't know if there's one person that's going to save us. It's going to take, you know, it's going to take a citizenry that's willing to, you know, participate, stay knowledgeable, and be tolerant of others. You know, but I think a first step would be to make sure that our legislative branch is stronger.
That's absolutely right. Where we strengthen politics at the local level, where we strengthen the legislative branch. Look, it's neither one person who's a threat to democracy in the United States. You know, personally, I do think that the president's unwillingness to accept some of those basic rules of our political system are very dangerous. He could only have won because of deep disenchantment, and I fear that he's going to be succeeded eventually, perhaps not in 2020 or 2024, but eventually by other populists who are actually more dangerous to the system, more determined to undermine it even than him. And the same way, there's not going to be one savior. This is a question of us, over the course of many years, many decades, addressing some of the shortcomings of our political system and re-engaging with citizens. That's really, you know, if I go around the country talking about this stuff and so on, that's really what I'm trying to make a tiny country.
You know, one thing we might think about doing too, Pete, is to talk about this as a legitimate national security issue. You know? Because when we are acting the way we're acting right now in our, you know, politics by memes, we really open the door for our adversaries to inject more false information or more hatred, or to feed off of these divisions. And I'm under the impression that a lot of these divisions are magnified beyond what they really are. Not everything is as serious as pro-life versus pro-choice, and the moderate middle gets left out of the conversation. I'm under the impression that a lot of our divisions I'm not so convinced that the American public is as divided as it's made out to be on all the issues. I do think our political class is quite divided, and a lot of them have gotten in the position of power because they've fed off of our divisions.
Yeah. My girlfriend made a great point the other day with the president's tweets and whatnot, and if that was happening from a country like, say, Iran or Germany, it would be a significant problem for the world. We would all be going, "What the heck is going on over there?" And we've got to, like you said, have the legislators. Yeah, own a little bit more of that checkbook and that legislative, actually write some laws that maybe rein that stuff in, because you're right. And of course, you guys have taught me that we have term limits. You can absolutely vote somebody else into your office, and it seems that we always want someone else to have a new representative or senator, not me and my district. Leave me my district alone. So it's it's a lot of.
We love our representatives, but we don't like the representative body.
Yes. Hey, everybody. So this is Yascha Mounk. Like I said, he's written this fantastic book, and I know that you guys are always interested in things that I'm reading, and this is a fantastic book. It's called The People Vs Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. Of course, we have Dr. Rich, as always, bringing all the great knowledge and the practicality. We'd love to have you on another time again, Yascha. Maybe we can talk about what Rich and I have seen in conflict zones and bringing quote-unquote democracy to those places. But I just wanted to thank you, and really it was a fascinating chat, and I really appreciate it.
Good talking to you, Yascha.
Thanks a lot. This is a ton of fun. Sure, I'd love to come back.